continue with pragmatics and meaning, and we'll study the last type of meaning, which is implicature. Okay. So before that, I would like to do a review for what we did last week. So last week, let's do a review first. So last week, we studied two kinds of implied messages, right? And we said that the first type of implied message is entailment, and the second type is presupposition, right? So we'll just go over them one more time. So entailment is a relationship, right, between two statements, and it's a relationship that has to do with logic, right? So it's a logical relationship, okay, between two statements. So when you have two statements, let's say statement P and statement Q, we're talking about entailment now. So P and Q have to be related logically, right? Right? And also literally too, okay? So it has to do with the meaning that is literal of P and Q, okay? So if when you have a statement, let's say P, that is true, right? So Q has to be true too, right? Logically speaking. So Q is a statement that you can get from P. After reading P, you'll get the sentence Q, the statement Q, as a result of logical connection, okay? So the truth of one implies inescapably, meaning unavoidably, the truth of the other one, okay? Because of the logical relationship between them, okay? So an example here is, if you have this first statement, Tasom comes from Busan, right? As a P statement, okay? And let's suppose that that's a fact, okay? Let's suppose that that's true, okay? Then the statement Q, which is implied in P, is Tasom comes from South Korea, right? Because there's a logical relationship, there's a literal relationship between the first and the second statement, and it's in this word, Busan, right? Because we know that Busan is part of South Korea, for example. So if the first one is true, the second one has to be true, right? Because Busan has to be in South Korea, right? So that's what we call entailment. So entailment is just like a straightforward relationship between two statements, right? And you can arrive at the second statement, the Q statement, by just reading the first statement, right? It's in there. You don't have to think further, but it's already in there, right? It's not about you, it's about the statement, the P statement that has Q as a part of it, right? When you want to test whether sometimes our imagination or our thinking process can be limited, right? So there are two tests for you to test whether the Q is part of P or not. Okay, the second statement is a part of the first statement or not. So you can do one of the two tests here, an exception test, right? So an exception test is when in every conceivable situation in which it's true that P is always true that Q. Okay? In other words, it follows from the relationship between the two sentences. Okay? So if P is true, Q has to always be true. So can you think of any exception when Q might not be true? If you can think of only one, even one exception, then that's not entailment, right? Because entailment means that the Q, the second statement, has to always be true because P is true. So you have to think of an exception. If there's even one exception, then that's not an entailment, okay? So that's one test. And the second one is the redundancy test. You know that Q always follows from P because Q is part of the P, right? So if you, after you say the first statement, you don't in real life, you don't have to say Q because it's redundant, right? Tasom comes from Busan. In fact, Tasom comes from South Korea. You don't have to say that because the listener will know if they know Busan, right? That Busan is part of South Korea. So Q will sound kind of redundant. If it doesn't sound redundant, then it's not entailment because it's not in there. So that's how we do the test for entailment. So, example. So, I have this as the P statement. Gyuho kissed his rabbit, Toki, passionately. So, can you, let's suppose that that's true. Let's suppose that that's true. You know, the entailment is a logical relationship, right? A logical relationship between the two statements. It doesn't have to do with the truth of the outside world, because the truth of P and Q has to be only logical, right? So let's suppose that he can do that, okay? So which of these is or are entailments of the original statement? So which of these has to be true if Gyuho could kiss his rabbit Toki passionately? So I'll give you maybe a minute to think about A to G. Which one of these has or have to be true when the original statement P is true? So what about A? If he kissed the rabbit passionately, does it always mean that he kissed the rabbit? Yes, right? Because if he kissed it passionately, then he must have kissed it, right? So A is an entailment of that, right? If he kissed it passionately, you cannot say he didn't kiss it, right? So A is an entailment. The rabbit was kissed by Gyuho. Is that always true when he kissed the rabbit passionately? Yes, right? This is just the passive voice version, right? So it's the same thing as number A, right? But it's just the passive voice version. The rabbit was kissed. Yes, that's true, right? Even though it doesn't mention who, but the fact that it was kissed is true. So that's it. Gyuho touched the rabbit with his lips. So is that true? You cannot kiss without other things, right? So you have to do it with your lips. So number D is 2, because kiss means to touch something with lips, right? Passionately or not passionately, okay? Number E, Gyuho married the rabbit. No, right? Doesn't have any relationship. When people kiss or when a person kisses an animal, then they don't need to be married, right? For example, in the case of Jeha that we looked at last week, right? It doesn't mean that they're married. The rabbit kissed Gyuho too? No, not necessarily, right? Kiss could be like one-sided thing, okay? So this is not right. So D is not an entailment. Gyuho kissed the rabbit many times. Passionately could be just one time, right? So no, not necessarily true. It could be true, but not necessarily true. So, but in the entailment relationship, Q has to be true always, necessarily be true. Gyuho did not kiss his rabbit. That's the opposite, right? So no entailment. Gyuho is the owner of the rabbit. Is that necessarily true? No, it can be true, but not necessarily true. So only A to D, right, are entailments of the original statement. So that's entailment, okay? Okay, for the sake of argument, his could be other people. Gyuho, you know, if the previous sentence is Krista has a rabbit, Gyuho kissed his rabbit passionately. His could refer to Krista, right, for the sake of argument. But here, so not necessarily true if there's like a preceding statement, but that's a good point. So it depends on whether that his is indexed with something that comes before or not. If it indexes with Gyuho, then maybe he's the owner. Okay? Maybe, but maybe not too, because when you say his, like his doesn't necessarily mean like you have to own it, right? Krista drives his car. Maybe he doesn't own it, but his parent, like, it's his parents' car, but still his in another sense, right? Then we can come to presupposition. Presupposition is a different type of entailment. It's a different type of implied message. It's close to entailment, but it's like a subtype of entailment, okay? Presupposition is like entailment in that it involves implication, meaning it involves some kind of implied message, but it's more than just simple implication. It's just more than a simple implied message. If P, a statement P, presupposes Q, it implies that the truth of Q is taken for granted and is treated as uncontroversial, meaning this is not the logical relationship, but this is the kind of the meaning that the speaker who says P has in his mind, and he takes it, that person, the speaker or the writer, the person takes it as uncontroversial, meaning he doesn't have any doubt about it. So it's presupposed, meaning he has that kind of assumption before. So that truth is assumed by the speaker to be already known to the addressee, right? Whether it's known or not known, we don't know, but we know that the speaker is sure about that presupposition, no matter from what perspective it is said. So in the case of entailment, if you compare that, in the case of entailment, the truth of P has to yield the truth of Q too, right? So that's the logical relationship. But in terms of presupposition, whatever perspective you say it from, whatever perspective you say the P from, like just perspective of positive, meaning just a statement, or negative, or questions, we talked about that last time, or even modelized perspective, the Q has to always be true, no matter from what perspective, because the speaker takes it that the Q is uncontroversial, right? So this is what the speaker has in mind. So it doesn't matter whether you negate it, negative point of view, or whether or not you make it into a question, or whether you modelize it using may, might, can, could. The speaker takes it as, a sure thing, as uncontroversial. So in this case, the P, the relationship between the P and Q is different from this, right? Because in the entailment, both have to always be true. But for this, Q, the presupposition thing, the presupposition remains true, no matter from what perspective you say the P from. Okay? So, for example, let's suppose that there are 5 speakers here from A to E, and each person says a different thing. The King of Korea is bald. The King of Korea is not bald. So that's the perspective of a negative point of view, right? Is the King of Korea bald? So that's the perspective of a question. If the King of Korea is bald, he should wear a hat in the winter. That's like conditionalized, right? A suggestion like that. Or the King of Korea may be bald. So five people here, 5 speakers, say 5 different things. But what unites all of them is the fact that all of them presuppose, all of them assume that there's a King of Korea, right? So no matter what you say here, no matter what they say here, is the King of Korea bald? He or she thinks that there's such a person as the King of Korea. So this is the presupposition of all these. So no matter from what perspective you say it, the presupposed message has to always be true. So this is a different kind of implied message. Okay? So like this, Mary's brother bought 3 horses. You can talk about both the presupposition and entailment. For the entailment, Mary's brother bought 3 horses. It means it entails that Mary's brother bought 3 animals, for example, right? Or bought something, right? Bought 3 animals or bought something even, right? And then for the presupposition, when a speaker says this, he or she assumes that the brother exists. He may have misunderstood it, that Mary has a brother, but that's what he assumed nonetheless. We don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what he presupposed when he said that, right? Mary's brother bought 3 horses, for example, and so on, right? So that's kind of the difference between the two. And then today we'll talk about implicature, okay? But before we talk about the implicature, we can do some practice on the relationship between statements in terms of entailment and presupposition before we move on, to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So, first one, there's the P statement, less than 5 students are over 30, and Q, less than 5 students are over 35. So what do you think? You can use the exception test, or you can use the redundant test. But in this case, maybe the redundant test is more difficult. So you just use the exception test. So Q has to be like somewhere in the P, right, to be true, right? P has to cover the Q, right? So does it entail or not? So the first sentence, less than 5 students are over 30 years old. So less than 5 are over 30 years old, right? So if this is 30 years, this is the point. So we have less than 5, meaning you can have 0 to 4, right? Less than 5 is 0 to 4, right? So 0 to 4 are somewhere there in that shaded region. So, shaded region up until maybe 100, if that's like the kind of the highest that you could go in terms of human age. So does it entail that less than 5 students are over 35 always? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes, right? Because this area covers everything. It covers here too, right? 35. So in that case, it entails it. Let's suppose that this is the same. 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. Let's suppose that, so if we say that everything is like that, right? This is 37, 8, 9, 40, like that. So that's enough. So this is the diagram, right? So let's suppose we know that there are only 0 to 4 students here. If Q, less than 5 students are over 35 years of age, what does that mean? So like less than 5 is like that, right? So over 35. So it doesn't matter if you have 0 people here or if you have 0 people here, less than 5, then it still covers the area, right? So in this case, it's still less than 5 that are over 35, right? So P entails Q in that case, okay? So it doesn't matter how many you have. 0, let's suppose that you have 0 here. Or even you have 0 here, 1 here, 2 here, 1 here. Still, the Q is always true, right? Or you have 0 here, you have 1 here, you have 2 here. Still, the Q statement is true, right? So it's still less than 5. Okay? Number 2, no student came to class early. No student came to class. Does P entail Q or not? No student came to class early, right? No student came to class early, meaning they may have come to class late, right? They may have arrived late, for example, right? Does it always mean no student came to class? No, because you have cases where they arrived late, right? So it's not always true. Q is not always true. It doesn't follow from P necessarily, right? Some may still have come to class, but late. They arrived late. So Q is not an entailment of P. So P doesn't entail Q in this case. Okay? Number 4, less than 5 students are over 35, and less than 5 students are over 30 years of age. So same thing, if you have less students are over 35, so you have here, and you say that, okay, above here, it's less than 5, 0 to 4. But the Q statement is less than 5 are over 30 years of age. So you want to put it, do you want to put it to the test whether this would include this or not? But does it include it always? No, right? Because you can see that the P statement, every student came, less than 5 students are over 35 is like this area. So it covers this area, right? But the Q statement, less than 5 students are over 30 years of age. It covers this area. So you can see that this area doesn't come into this area at all, so there's a gap there. So it's not necessarily true that less than 5 students are over 30 years of age. So that's how we do it. So if there is an exception, then it doesn't entail it. Okay? It can be true, but not necessarily true. Number 5, every student will go to the party. Does it mean that some student will go to the party? Does it always mean that? Does it always mean that some student will go? Yes or no? No exception. Is there an exception that when you have everyone going to the party, this has to be true? There's no exception to that at all. Can you think of an exception when it's not some? When everyone goes, then everyone goes, not some, right? When we are sure that everyone will go to the party, we cannot be sure that only some will go because all can go, right? So it's not only some, it's all, right? So Q can be true, but not necessarily true. There's an exception when everybody goes, right? So in this case, P doesn't entail Q, right? So Q has to always be true, right? But in this case, no. Because if you are lucky, everyone will go, right? For example. Number 6, Krista used to smoke. What does it mean? Krista used to smoke. It means in the past, he smoked, right? Perhaps on a regular basis or not. We don't know, but Krista, maybe on a regular basis. Krista used to smoke, meaning in the past, he smoked. Does it always entail Q that Krista no longer smokes nowadays? Yes or no? No, right? Because maybe P is said from a person who knew Krista 10 years ago, but he hasn't talked to Krista for 10 years, so he doesn't know about his habits right now, right? So Q doesn't have to be true always. So P doesn't entail Q in this case. Okay? For presuppositions, Gil-ho's sister called him today. What might be some presuppositions of this statement? There could be more than one presupposition. When somebody says this, what is the presupposition? What might be a presupposition? He has a sister, right? Gil-ho has at least a sister, had at least one sister, right? So that might be a possible presupposition. Let's test whether this is a presupposition or not. So how do you do the test? This has to always be true, regardless of the perspective you said, the original statement, right? So if you say, Gil-ho's sister did not call him today, Gil-ho's sister did not call him today, is this statement still true? Gil-ho's sister did not call him. It's true, right? Or did Gil-ho's sister call him today? Still, that person assumes that he has a sister, right? So this is true, okay? Another presupposition might be there's a person by the name of Gil-ho, like that, okay? Number 2, Tasom knows Krista is the best looking professor in Hanyang. So what is the presupposition here? The presupposition that the speaker has, which may or may not be true in reality. The presupposition is this part, right? Krista is the best looking professor in Hanyang. So that part is the presupposition. How to test whether that is a presupposition or not? Just change the perspective. Tasom doesn't know that Krista is the best looking professor in Hanyang. Well, sorry for her, she should know that. right? But still, that's still true, right? That's still true according to the person who says it, right? Or if I ask her, Tasom, do you know that Krista is the best-looking professor? Still, I still assume, the person who says that still assumes that Krista is the best-looking, right? So that is a presupposition, right? Other presupposition might be Krista is a professor. There's a place called Hanyang like that, okay? And Hanyang is a university or a school like that. What about number 3? Tasom thinks Krista has stopped smoking. Can you say that Krista has stopped smoking is a presupposition of this is one of the presuppositions of this sentence? No, because this verb to think is different from the verb to know, right? To think doesn't necessarily mean that this is a fact, right? So does Tasom think that, or Tasom may not think that? So Krista doesn't have to be, it doesn't mean that Krista no longer smokes and so on. So maybe one of the presuppositions is there's an individual, there's a person by the name of Krista. Maybe that's what you can make of that as a presupposition. But if you have this by itself, Krista has stopped smoking without the think, okay? You have this by itself, one of the possible presuppositions is Krista no longer smokes, right? Krista no longer smokes. And that's the entailment. But the presupposition is Krista smoked before, right? So Krista smoked before. Because if you say, if you change the perspective, has Krista stopped smoking, or Krista may have stopped smoking, all of those would still contain that presupposition that Krista smoked before. Okay? So we talked about entailment, we talked about presupposition. Now the last type of implied message is what we call implicature. This is on the slide for today. Okay? So if you consider this statement, the dog has stopped sleeping in its kennel, its cage, meaning kennel is cage. So it entails that the dog does not sleep in the kennel at the present time nowadays, right? And it presupposes that the dog exists, it slept in the kennel before, and the kennel belongs to the dog, and so on, right? Those are possible presuppositions, okay? Which can be right or wrong. Now, we'll talk about implicature today. So implicature is also a different kind of implied message. But implicatures can be defeated, meaning implicatures can be canceled without self-contradiction. For the entailment, you cannot cancel the entailment because when P is true, Q has to always be true, right? So both work in the same direction. You cannot cancel it. And presupposition, you cannot cancel the presupposition either because for the presupposition, it has to always be true regardless of the perspective, right? But implicature can be canceled without any contradiction. So implicature like this one, Mary had a baby and got married. The implied meaning here is when you have the word and in English, it usually, I say that it usually, it doesn't have to always be true. It usually gives out the implicature that the first in the series happens before the second thing in the series. Like Mary had a baby and got married. This one meaning like she got pregnant before she got married. So she had sex before marriage, in other words, right? So that's the implicature of this one. Because and in English at least usually means that what happens before and happens in real life before the second one in the series. But that doesn't have to always be true. You can deny it. Mary had a baby and got married, not necessarily in that order. So without being contradictory, right? So this is what we call implicature. Okay? Implicature is likely to be true, but not necessarily true, unlike entailment and unlike presupposition. Okay? For the entailment, here, just to compare, entailment, John ate oatmeal for breakfast this morning. So it entails that Jane ate breakfast this morning, for sure, right? You cannot deny it like implicature. You cannot say Jane ate oatmeal for breakfast and she didn't eat breakfast this morning. So that would result in contradiction. So you cannot cancel the entailment. And presupposition, Mary stopped smoking. It presupposes Mary smoked in the past. You cannot, you cannot deny it or cancel it. Mary stopped smoking, but she did not smoke in the past. You cannot do that with presupposition. So implicature is a special kind of implied message which is likely to be true, and it has to be worked out from the context, but it's not necessarily true. It has a high chance of being true. That's for implicature. Okay? So this is like a table that summarizes all the type of implied meaning that we talked about. For the characteristics, the general characteristic of entailment is logical inference, right? So we talked about logical relationship. Presupposition is a personal inference, meaning the speaker has that presupposition. But for implicature, it's a mutual inference that both speakers share to the case, meaning both the speaker and the hearers share that presupposition. Share that implicature. Okay? And the listener has to make the inference on his or her own to figure out the meaning. Okay? So it's mutual. So if they understand each other, it means they share the same implicature. But for the presupposition, it only belongs to the speakers, not the listener. And for the entailment, it's only the sentence that has the entailment, right? So we can distinguish three kinds of meaning. And the second characteristic, divisibility, meaning can you cancel it? For the entailment, you cannot cancel it without self-contradiction. For the presupposition, no. But for the implicature, yes. Because implicature depends on the context and it depends on the understanding of two people, right? So you can, one person can misunderstand. Okay? And constancy under family operations, meaning different perspectives. Remember, if you negate it, if you modelize it, if you conditionalize it, and so on, if you make it into a question, will that implied message survive or not? For the entailment, no. For the presupposition, yes, which is like the test, right? Does Tasom know Krista is the best looking like that? So this case, the presupposition always survives because it belongs to the speaker uncontroversially, right? But the implicature, no. Okay? So you can see the differences here, the main differences. And there are two kinds of implicatures that we'll talk about in this class. The first one has to do with conventional implicatures. Okay? The conventional implicatures are derived directly from the meaning of words in use, which can be right or wrong. This is not entailment. Okay? Entailment has to always be right. But in this one, Mr. Han is a gangster, but he's a nice person. So you can see that there is a but here that makes you think that, well, this first statement contradicts the second statement, right? But what is in contradiction here? What is contradictory here? He is a gangster, but he's a nice person. So why does the second one contradict the first one? Because of the word gangster, right? The word gangster can mean that a person is usually not nice, right? But that's not necessarily true, right? Because you can do this kind of negation, right? So gangster here is usually not nice. That's the implicature, a meaning that has the potential to be true, and people usually think of it as being true, but not necessarily true, unlike entailment. Okay? Laptops are getting cheaper all the time. Furthermore, their quality is improving. For this one, the furthermore implies that the quality standard is maintained as laptops have become more inexpensive, which may not be true. But according to the speaker and our understanding of what he uses here, the two go in the same direction because of the word furthermore, right? If you put but in there, the relationship will be different, and you can guess that from this context. Okay? So that's conventional implicature. It has to do with words in use. So we'll come back and talk about this next time, but we'll focus on the second type of implicature today, which is called conversational implicatures. The first one is conventional. This is conversational. So it has to do with conversation. Okay? So conversational implicatures must be derived from contextual clues. If A asks this question, what on earth has happened to the bulgogi, right, the food? The dog is looking very happy. You see this, that on the surface, there seems to be no relationship between A and B, right? Because he asks about what happened to the bulgogi, right? Why it's not there, for example. But B gives him like a seemingly irrelevant answer. The dog is looking very happy, right? So logically speaking, in terms of entailment, there's no association between bulgogi and a dog. So no entailment, right? No entailment here at all. It's not logical, so there's no entailment there. And the being happy doesn't presuppose the eating of bulgogi, right? So there's no presupposition either. So the implicature here, right, the conversational implicature occurs in this context, only in this context that, well, you can guess, right? Because you have that mutual understanding with the writer here that, well, the dog must have eaten it, right? And that's why he looks happy, for example, right? So you get that meaning only because you guess from like very likely options here, right? So that's what we call implicature. This one is the same. What are all these hairs doing on the sofa? If you go into the sofa and you see a lot of hairs on the sofa, and your friend says, well, darling, or your lover says, darling, the dog has stopped sleeping in its kennel. Again, there's no relationship between A statement and B statement. There's no entailment, there's no presupposition at all between A and B. But you can still guess the meaning that B tries to imply, which is the dog is responsible for the hairs on the sofa, right? So we'll study this type of meaning here as to how it arises, okay? So implicature could be regarded as inferences that develop from a mutual understanding between two people and engage in interaction only. But as a third person observing the conversation or the exchange that is going on, you still understand that because you have the same common ground as the two speakers, okay? And in this case, you have just failed your English 374, which is this class exam. What a good day. You see that B here must be sarcastic, right? B must be sarcastic because you have that same background, like that failing an exam cannot make a good day for you, right? Cannot be a good day for you. So in that case, you know the meaning that he's being sarcastic because he wants to convey that meaning. So it's like an implied message that B is trying to give to A and to you at the same time as a reader. So we'll talk about how implicatures arise. So this philosopher/linguist, Paul Grice, 1975, comes up with the idea that, you know, participants in an exchange conversationally cooperate to be mutually understood. So in other words, when we have a conversation, we usually cooperate with the other person to be understood mutually, okay? Even we are not being cooperative socially, meaning even though we may be fighting, even though we may be having a quarrel, for example, we still cooperate conversationally so that the other person understands our point of view, okay? Or else there's no point in communicating at all, right? So we cooperated conversationally, not necessarily socially, meaning we might be in a fight, we might be having a quarrel, but we still want to make our point and get our point across to that person. Okay? And how do we do that? How do we cooperate conversationally? So we assume that each person will make a conversational contribution such as is required at the state at which it occurs by the accepted purpose of the exchange. In other words, it's kind of complicated. So in other words, we expect that the person we talk to and the person talking to us will say what is required to say, okay? For him to say, and at the time when it's appropriate to say, and relevant to the purpose of the exchange. Okay? That's what we assume. Okay? And specifically, that cooperation manifests itself in 4 different ways or 4 different maxims. Relation, quality, quantity, and manner. So there are 4 maxims to show our cooperation. And we do this all the time, no matter where, no matter when. And we do this subconsciously. So relation, the relation is say what is relevant. So we will say what is relevant. So always. Quality will say only what is true. Okay? We will not say what we don't have the evidence for or what we think that is fault. Quantity will say what only the right amount, not too much, not too little, right? Only the appropriate amount of things. We do not go off the topic. For example, manner, we must be clear. Avoid ambiguity, avoid wordiness, avoid vagueness, and so on. Right? So implicatures will arise from our observation of these 4 maxims. Okay? And sometimes we intentionally violate the maxim. Okay? So implicature arises when we observe the maxims or or when we flout the maxim. Flout meaning violate the maxim. Okay? So let me give an example. For this one, standard implicature, if A, as here, will Sally be at the meeting this afternoon, and B says her car broke down. So the message that we understand from B is, well, will she be in the meeting or not? What do you guess? It's likely that she would not be in the meeting, right? Considering B's message here, right? But B's message seems to be like irrelevant at first, right? But because A assumes that B cooperates, right? A assumes that B cooperates in the conversation. So A has to figure out, has to think about what B might mean having said that, right? So she tried to guess, and well, the meaning is Sally won't be at the meeting because A knows that when a person's car broke down, she would not be she wouldn't get to the meeting on time, right? For example, right? And in that case, she might not be at the meeting, right? So A has to go through different kinds of reasoning before arriving at this. Sally won't be at the meeting this afternoon, right? Because A assumes that B cooperates in the conversation, and B answer is relevant to the question, right? So because of the cooperation, okay? Or you can also flout the maxim, meaning you can violate the maxim, one of the maxims, in the way that your conversation partner understands or know, in the way that that person knows that you are violating the maxim. So like this, it's pouring rain. This is the outside context. And then you are 2 hours late already and the car gets a flat tire. You say, this is a fine state of affairs. Right? So you know from reading this and then in relation to the context that this cannot mean what it literally says, right? This has to be a sarcastic remark, for example. And the person who says this intentionally violates the maxim, right? Violate the maxim of quality, right? Because he or she doesn't believe, right? It's likely that she doesn't believe that, you know, that context is a fine state of affairs, right? But still, you know that he wants to make a point, and you know that he tries to be relevant, and you know that he or she violates the maxim intentionally. So you can arrive at this interpretation. This is a terrible state of affairs, which is the hidden meaning or the implied meaning. Okay. So example of flouting the maxims when somebody intentionally violates the maxim in order to convey something, in order to convey an implied message. So if the maxim of quality is violated, like avoid anything that's false. So that's the maxim of quality, right? Quality means like the standard of things, right? So you should say things that are true, things that you believe that is true only, right? But sometimes you violate that intentionally and you make it clear to the conversation partner that you are violating the maxim, so that's no problem because your conversation partner can guess, can arrive at the meaning. New York is the capital of Korea, isn't it? And then B says, yeah, and London is the capital of France, right? So this B doesn't believe, right? Himself doesn't believe that London is the capital of France, but he says that, right? And he hopes that A notices that, you know, B is kind of sarcastically giving that information, right? Just to get to this implied message that B intentionally gives false information and expect A to notice that, and then to convey the information that A statement is wrong to start with, right? So that's the kind of the purpose of why somebody would flout the maxim or why somebody would violate the maxim, okay, intentionally. Or the maxim of manner, avoid vagueness, right? So you should say things in a clear manner so that your conversation partner is not confused like that, right? So what are you baking? So the standard, the expected answer would be, I'm baking a cake, I'm baking whatever, right? Macaron, whatever. So, but instead, B says, BARTIDAYCK, and so on, birthday cake, for example, right? So why does one answer it in an unclear way like that, right? Considering that we are supposed to say things clearly, right? So B must have a purpose, and she knows that A would figure that out, perhaps because she doesn't want her kid, let's suppose that they have a kid. So maybe she doesn't want the kid to hear it, that it's a birthday cake. She wants to surprise him, for example. So she intentionally makes things unclear. Still, she cooperates, right? Still, she cooperates in the conversation by giving information, even though it's unclear. But she does that for the purpose of avoiding the third person to hear it or whatever, right? So she does it for a purpose. Okay. And the maximum quantity can be violated too, meaning quantity has to do with amount, right? We are supposed to give just only the appropriate amount of information, not more or not less, right? So what can you tell me about Susan's ability to concentrate on a task? So if A asks that question, she wants to evaluate Susan, for example, right? And B says, she's a butterfly flirting from flower to flower, right? So in this case, she doesn't give the right amount of information, right? Like, okay, this is how Susan is able to concentrate, and I found that she is able to concentrate well or something like that. But she gives this information, which is like too broad, right? She's a butterfly flirting from flower to flower, for example, right? So this means that B tries to make a point that Susan cannot concentrate, right? Just like a butterfly flying from one, flirting meaning flying from one flower to another flower, for example, right? So she cannot do that, okay? Finally, maxim of relation, we should say things that are relevant only to the question. But sometimes we violate the maxim, that maxim of relation, just to convey an implied message. What happened to my bulgogi? This is the same example. The dog is looking very happy. So it's seemingly irrelevant to the question. But in order to make a point that, well, the dog must have eaten it, right? So she intentionally violates the relation maxim, giving some kind of irrelevant. But she knows that A will notice that and then will try to to arrive at that implied message. Okay? But all in all, we see that the implied messages here only arise because some people flout the maxim, okay? And then the implied message doesn't have to always be true, right? Not necessarily a logical relationship between two statements, which is different from entailment and presupposition, but it's likely to be true in that context, okay? So in this context, A and B, as the readers, you can guess that B must have meant that the dog has eaten the bulgogi, for example, in that context only, and it's likely to be true, okay? So that's the third type of implicature. Now, what we can do is we have 15 minutes. We can practice the implicature and try to guess what the implied messages might be. So on the back of the handout, of the same handout that I passed out this morning, you have maybe 5 questions. Let's focus on the first 3 questions. So what do you think, for example, I give you the situation, mom and dad here in the first question. Mom says, what did you think of our kids' childish behavior last night? And dad says, well, boys will be boys, for example. What do you think dad wants to say here? What does it mean? Well, boys will be boys, right? That. And then what is the maxim that is being violated? And why? Why do you think that dad says that? What does it mean, boy will be boys? Meaning boys will be boys. Meaning, well, a boy will behave that way, like that. An immature person is an immature person, in other words. Obviously, he violates one of the maxims, right? He flouts the maxim because he's supposed to say, like, if he didn't violate it, he's supposed to say, well, I think that his behavior is nothing to worry about. We should not worry about his behavior, whatever, right? Or we should punish him, whatever, right? So, but here, he just gives this information. Well, boys will be boys, which is like not enough information, right? Theoretically speaking or practically speaking, is not, like, ideally speaking, is not enough information, right? So in this case, he violates which maxim? Quantity, right? The quantity maxim, okay? So it's not like enough information for mom to understand, right? So the intended message might be, so maxim violated is quantity, right? Quantity, the amount, right? And it's still relevant because he's talking about like boys, right? So it's still relevant in that case. The intended message, the implied message might be, well, it's not a big deal, get over it, you don't have to worry about it. So when he says this, it means the intended message is it's not a big deal, right? You don't have to worry about it, get over it, like that, to the mom, okay? Why do we have that intended message? Because mom assumes that dad is being cooperative, right? Mom assumes that dad is being cooperative in this conversation. And so, even though it looks like not enough information, mom has to figure out, right, what dad might want it to mean because she assumes that dad participates cooperatively in the conversation. And by telling something that mom already knows, boys will be boys, right? Everyone knows, right? Boys will be boys. It's like X is equal X. Everyone knows that. Everybody knows that, right? So this is what we call kind of a tautology, meaning you repeat the same thing, right? But when you repeat the same thing, it has a special meaning, especially in this case, right? So in other words, mom figures out that dad, by using the tautology here, he must be saying that there's nothing unusual. So everything is expected. X is expected to be X. Boys are expected to behave like boys, meaning immature persons who will be expected to behave like immature persons, for example. So there's nothing unusual about our child's behavior last night, so don't worry like that. Okay? So that's my example. So can you do number 2 and number 3? Number 2 is Seung-ryung's best friend, Hwan-sok. And then number 3 is a conversation between me and my colleague. So what's Seung-ryung's intended message here? Does he like or not like Krista's class? He may like it, but not always, not all aspects of Krista's class. So it's not like he jumped because he wants to come to class every day. It's like he wants to see Krista so bad like that. No, right? But it's maybe like it's okay, but it's not great. It's not a wow class or something. So that's maybe his intended message. Okay, and so not really, but it's more complicated than that. Not really, and it's not like I love it either. So it's like maybe in between, like that. And the maxim that is violated is the maxim of maybe manner, because it's still relevant, right? It's still relevant, and still he says what he believes to be true, and that's like maxim of quality, right? And he just gives maybe a bit enough information already, but clearly he violates the maxim of manner because the message is kind of cryptic, meaning you have to guess it, right? It's not as clear as you would want it to be. Like he could have said, no, not really, but I don't love it either, and so on, right? So it's not very clear. So maxim of manner, maybe. So, and Hwan-sok assumes that Seung-ryung is being cooperative in the conversation, right? So he has to guess why Seung-ryung gives this unclear information. Maybe because the unclear information implies his complicated feeling about Krista's class, for example, right? It's not like he likes it very much, and it doesn't mean he hates it either. So it's in the middle or in between the two extremes, like that. Okay. The last one, number 3. Do you have any lazy students this semester? I said all students are lazy. What's the intended message here? Do you think that I believe that all students are lazy? Of course not, right? Because some students work very hard, and I know that, right? So this might not be what Krista truly believes in, right? So he intentionally violates the maxim of quality, right? Because he says what he believes to be false himself. Because I know that not all students, right, are lazy. Some students are very hardworking. So in this case, the maxim violated is the maxim of quality, right? And the implied message might be, Miss Only, that's a stupid question to ask, like that. That question makes no sense because we all know that we have lazy students in our class, for example. Okay. And the reason might be Krista like exaggerate the answer, right? Just to emphasize that he exaggerates the answer, overemphasized the answer, in order to point out that that question is like to be taken for granted, to be assumed already. Okay? And there is no need to ask question. Okay? So we'll come back to do number 4 and number 5 next time, and we'll go on to the next.